It's very nice to be here. Welcome everybody to the event today on technology versus the rule makers, exploring the conflict between new inventions and regulations. I'm going to turn our panel over to turn our discussion over to our expert all-star panel in just a moment to discuss these issues. Before I do, I thought it might be helpful to actually frame a few of the important policy issues that we discuss a lot in the world of innovation and technology policy, not only in Washington, but in state capitals and international capitals these days, which may help frame the discussion that we're going to have here today with our panelists. These are just some of the sort of technologies and issues that we're frequently hearing discussed in the world of technology policy today. And in my department, in the technology policy department at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, these are our sort of top priority areas, if you will, sort of the future technology policy flashpoints that we spend a lot of time covering, writing law review and econ review articles about, working papers, even books, and trying to bring some focus on these issues that are making a lot of news. Most recently, I've published the second edition of a book on this topic, on these topics called Permissionless Innovation, the Continuing Case for Comprehensive Technological Freedom. And what I try to do in this book is to frame technology policy debates as sort of a clash of vision, if you will, clash of visions between this idea of permissionless innovation, or the general notion of the freedom to innovate without prior restraint, and the general freedom to innovate and even fail and take risks without that constraint, versus the idea of sort of a precautionary principle towards technological risk and innovation, or the crafting of public policies in such a way that new inventions aren't allowed until such time as their creators prove that they won't bring about any sort of risk or harm to society, to the economy, to culture, whatever else. And it's not a perfect way to sort of frame the paradigms that govern technology policy, but I think it crudely helps to think about it in these ways, because whenever you talk about any of these emerging technology issues that I just highlighted a moment ago, you always sort of see and hear these themes come out of, one viewpoint looks at innovation as something that needs to be carefully guided. The other thinks, no, it can be more freewheeling and open-ended. And the sort of precautionary principle mindset thinks about the need for bringing stability or equilibrium and in trying to anticipate risk before we move forward, whereas the permissionless innovation crowd is more about spontaneity and experimentation and adapting to risk as is needed. And this leads to a whole different set of policy solutions being proposed by these two different sort of schools of thinking about innovation, with the precautionary school thinking more about how we can come up with these sort of preemptive ex ante sort of top-down approaches to dealing with risk, versus the sort of more reactive after-the-fact ex post type of an approach. And so what you get are these sort of two different sort of set of solutions, with the precautionary approach taking more of a top-down approach of thinking about maybe prohibiting certain types of innovations, or limiting information, or licensing certain types of innovation. At a minimum, it's sort of regulatory oversight of these innovations, product guidance, defaults, so on and so forth, or maybe even just a form of sort of informal agency threats to sort of govern these things. Whereas the permissionless innovation crowd would say, no, let's take more of a bottom-up approach. Let's think about how we can educate people about risks, empower them with different tools, utilize maybe common law solutions or property and contract law solutions, or even other common law solutions like torts or product defects law. And then if all else fails, you come to sort of a very limited and targeted legal intervention to address technological risk. And so just in closing this sort of opening of mine, I try to put it all into sort of this one picture of, precautionary principle mindset versus permissionless innovation that I talk about in the book, and thinking about sort of the range of options that policymakers might employ to try to deal with the range of technological risks out there. And it's important to note that we rarely are at either the very top or the very bottom of that spectrum. We're almost always somewhere in between. But generally in the academic literature and in sort of the battles about tech policy, people are generally framing it as a choice between sort of those two visions. And then what drives specifically the application of certain types of precautionary principle thinking? I divide it into 5 buckets in my work. I talk about policies that are being proposed to try to address either privacy on one hand, or safety, which could be a broad bucket of issues, security concerns, economic disruption, and then of course intellectual property. And so all of these emerging technologies that we see coming around today, whether we're talking about robots and autonomous vehicles or driverless cars on one hand, or data-driven innovation like the Internet of Things, online advertising, advanced medical innovation, 3D printing, cryptography innovation, Bitcoin, blockchain innovation, VR, AR. I write papers on every one of these things. I have papers, and I'm constantly using sort of these sort of buckets and saying, okay, what are the specific policy threats that we see? And this is the whiteboard that hangs in my office at the Mercatus Center of how we sort of weight which of these technologies are likely to be affected by those specific concerns. And this is not a scientific weighting, to be sure. It's just an effort by my staff and I to try to address, okay, if you're doing robotics or you're doing Bitcoin, what do we think is going to be the driver of public policy in that area? And then the person, either internally or externally, who has the best skill set in sort of like dealing with, say, the privacy and security implications of the world of the Internet of Things, or the intellectual property concerns regarding 3D printing, or the tax considerations associated, or tax or labor issues associated with the sharing economy or Bitcoin. We then find people to help us, or we do them according to this sort of matrix. So that might just be a useful way to help frame these debates and think about these sort of conflict divisions between different worldviews or public policy paradigms, if you will, governing innovation policy. And maybe that'll help us frame the discussion here today.